Hey everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today on another edition of Tariff Thursday. I'm your host, Mike. I'm the community manager here at MFD. At MFD, we help brands source, finance, and manage inventory across 25 countries and 20 industries. And we also help businesses reduce their tariff exposure and optimize their sourcing and improve their supply chain resilience. It's such a pleasure and honor to be joined here by Pranay and Hamaad for part 6 of our Tariff Thursday. Pranay and Hamaad, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Great. And before we get started, I just wanted to mention as well, we're offering 100 free 25-minute supply chain consults this month. So you can book yours. I'm going to share the booking link in the comments. So if you would like to chat one-on-one about your business and a little bit what's going on, if you need help guidance through your supply chain, we're more than happy to chat one-on-one. Let me go to the studio chat, and here we go. Awesome. So let's just do a quick recap. I think, Hamaad, we're having like an echo thing again, unfortunately.
With me?
I think so. I'm coming in double whenever I talk. Hello? 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 Yep. No more double. Okay. Great. Well, not so great. Hamaad hopefully will come back shortly. And also Pranay will come back shortly. Here we go. Hello?
Does that work?
Hello? Yep. I think we're good. Great. Awesome. So just to recap where we're at since our last Tariff Thursday. We still have the pause on reciprocal tariffs happening. Those are going to that window is going to end on July 8th, and China raised counter tariffs to the US at 125%. We also have there's also talks about Trump negotiating with certain countries, which I'm sure a lot of countries are lining up to negotiate how making sure that they don't actually get their reciprocal tariff rate that was originally proposed last month. Cargo volume from China to the U.S. is projected to drop about 40% this month, just in terms of some of the reaction. And then we also had we also announced this morning a trade deal with the UK. I think our first trade deal of this entire administration. So I'll be honest, reading through some of like the press releases, it's still sparse or not fully disclosed the details of what the agreement is. Maybe it's just kind of like a base agreement, and then they're still kind of working out the details. From what we know, it's still going to be a 10% tariff on UK imports. That's going to remain the same in place. But originally cars was going to be taxed at 25%. That's going to come down at a reduced rate. We don't know what that reduced rate is, but it's certainly going to come down. I think as relates to SMBs, and also, even if you do import from UK, but I think more so, what's your reaction, Hamaad and Pranay, over this in terms of, is this since we now have one trade agreement coming into effect, do you think now we're on the road to get more trade agreements from different countries coming into effect that will bring down their rate of the reciprocal tariff rate?
So on the cars, by the way, I think it might be down to 10%, but still TBD maybe.
Okay.
But yeah, look, I think, and by the way, they're only hitting on certain sectors. So I think there's even potentially more to come in this agreement at a later time. And is it a blueprint, I think you're asking for?
Yes.
Or for future agreements. It's too hard to predict that it is or is not. I think the U.S. will do and protect its interests, obviously, in certain sectors. So, for example, in this agreement, it's about automobiles, it's about U.S. beef exports, it's about aerospace engines coming in from Rolls-Royce. And so, wherever U.S. interests can be elevated, I think, if it behooves the U.S. to do it, then they'll do it. If not, then, and you'll notice that this wasn't just all one-sided, right? You'll notice that, there are imports coming in from the U.K. at lower tariffs, but there's also exports from the U.S. that are going over there to the U.K. Especially when you think about the meat, beef, and chicken, the U.K. still has standards that are above where the U.S. is in terms of what they'll allow, like chlorinated chicken and the quality of beef. So those still are being held, but they'll still import some of this stuff into their country.
No, those are really good points. And that also as well, this agreement is also going back the other way in terms of UK imports of American goods. What's your reaction to this, Pranay?
I think that if they run this through, then I think British restaurants will actually serve better tasting beef. It'll be nice.
Shots fired.
Wow. Wow.
But anyway, coming back to the reality of this is, I think this is the first of like several bilateral trade agreements that you're going to see. I think the future of global trade is bilateral trade agreements, not multilateral or unilateral trade agreements. I think that Trump is just trying to reset how global trade is negotiated, and it comes from more of a geopolitical point of view than from a, I don't know, like a logical transactional point of view. And so upsetting the apple cart is one way to actually get the bad apples at the bottom of the cart out. And I think that the problem is all the good apples suffer too. And so you break a bunch of apples when you do that. Let's just put it this way. The UK is not the most important trade agreement out there.
Yes.
Because the UK runs a trade surplus with the US, so it's easy to do that. UK buys $68 billion a year from the US, which is like 2% of their imports, and so they're an important trade partner, but not that important because politically they're less important. Geopolitically and defense-wise, security-wise, they're more important. So showing that they can negotiate on trade allows them to continue to keep the close relationships that they had politically. I think that it's going to be really interesting for us to see how Trump deals with the China surrogate countries, which is basically Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, those sorts of countries. How he works with Taiwan is going to be really interesting to see, because I don't think that the tariffs are going away anytime soon from zero. Nothing's going to zero ever again. And I think 10% is basically now the new zero. And so whether you had customs duties or not in the past, like for example, if you think of polyester clothing, 32% import duties, and now you add a 10% base tariff on that. So now you're effectively paying 42% no matter what you buy. Trying to figure out how he starts doing these multilateral trade agreements will also be very useful to then figure out what countries you're actually going to have favored nation status. And so most favored nation, MFN, that you see in legal documents and legal agreements actually came from trade agreements. Most favored nation status basically came from bilateral trade agreements. That's literally where the actual origin of the word came from.
Wow.
So you're going to see a lot more most favored nation statuses between the US and other countries. China's doing the same thing, and EU is going to do the third thing. So those are the three big blocks: European Union, China, and the US.
I would say that, it seems like as of now, and I could be wrong, but China really is not really pushing to negotiate.
No, they're in Switzerland this week.
They did?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the US and China sent people to Switzerland this week.
Okay.
Yeah, it started 2 days ago. They were like, yeah, we want to talk.
Okay. Well, what, in your mind, what other countries do you think are gonna strike a deal before July 8th? I
think India will do it.
That was my guess.
India needs it. I think India needs them. At least one LATAM country will do it, maybe two. And it will not be Mexico.
Why won't it be Mexico?
Because Mexico already has a lot going for it in terms of access to the US market. I think it'll be one of the South American countries. Who knows? Because the biggest group that is going to suffer because of these tariffs is BRICS. BRICS is going to be broken apart by these tariffs. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That was the new third block that was starting. You're going to see one Southeast Asian country do it, one LATAM country do it, and you're going to probably see, I think those are the countries I would bet on to see. And I think you'll probably see India do it. India needs it, because now with the war starting with Pakistan and the stuff that's starting to go around, India needs it.
Got it. India, you think they'll be able to get a deal done there, and then also one other Latin American country,
and one Southeast Asian country,
and one Intelligent Asia.
Whether they'll get it done, I don't know, but I know they'll come to the table and we need to make a deal. I don't know if they'll make it by the deadline, but
in my opinion, they're already at the table. That's why Tulsi Gabbard went to India, and that's why JD Vance went to India.
Got it. How and in terms of the ones that, let's say they aren't able to reach a deal, for example, for other countries before July 8th. Do you expect another extension of this 90-day pause, or do you think that's it?
I think every single country that's at 10% tariffs is just laying low right now.
And I would expect the pause. It can absolutely be extended, because if they know they're at the table, they just need to hammer out some details. They'll say another month or another couple months. That's not often.
Got it. I'd love to also as well talk. I mean, as you mentioned, U.S. and China are starting to talk, but freight from China has also continued to drop. It's estimated that the imports have dropped by 30-40%. Where do you see production eventually moving to? Or at least taking up the slack from the 35-40% drop?
First of all, I don't know if the 35% drop is all going away from China. I think that there's three groups of people in that thing. First is people who canceled orders because they don't want to pay the tariff. And I know friends in Southeast Asian countries who are just flying into China and swooping in and buying deals from those Chinese factories. Great stock deals available in Chinese factories due to American cancellations, right? For Europe, for Australia, for South America, people are buying those goods left, right, and center from Chinese factories. So that's the first group. And those groups would probably go back if the tariffs came back down, but then they would probably have to deal with different factories or whatever it is. The second group is people who are like, wait and watch. Oh, we'll see what happens. Let's wait for a lower tariff. People who are on 30% gross margins and have a 145% tariff basically means that their margin got completely wiped out, plus they're in the red now. They'll be like, I'll just basically hold these goods and wait for them to get here. So I pay for the goods and wait in China. And that could be why the goods are not shipping. And so you're going to see that compensation happen once basically there's a deal of even any kind. So a lot of that goods will basically flow out. And then the third type of customer is basically somebody who's essentially has to move out of China. And that is going to take at least 6 months to actually fructify. And moving out of China is not going to be easy. We are talking to a lot of companies in manufacture who basically feel like they need to move out of China. But I think that the answer in the future is not going to be this one click fits all. It's going to be, where do your components come from? Where does your assembly happen? And where do your finished goods actually get created? And then where do you ship from? And you are going to see more and more mid-sized companies actually evaluate their supply chain from that angle. And that is essentially where you're starting to see China evolve to, because China has traditionally been an net importer of raw materials and a net exporter of finished goods. What you're going to see is now China be a net importer of raw materials, because otherwise its industrial base can't operate. But you're going to see China become a net exporter of intermediates or components, not finished goods. And you will see the finished goods volume drop significantly because to the US. What I think is going to happen is China is going to be like, okay, you guys create the assembly in other countries, because assembly is easy to do. Well, relatively easy to do. And then finished goods exporting from those countries is going to be easy. So Bangladesh is the greatest example of how they took a country with no indigenous components or raw materials, no indigenous actual production capacity, installed production capacity in that country, and then bought raw materials and actually created it into a finished product system, and essentially took over 18% of the world's apparel industry. Bangladesh is basically smaller than a small state in China. Bangladesh is basically smaller than Arizona, but it controlled 18% of the global apparel trade. And I'm talking about in 1992. Bigger than Pakistan, bigger than India, bigger than everything. India had 5% of the global trade. The way they got 18% of the global trade is they essentially created a very efficient financing industry using back-to-back letters of credit. They essentially created a very efficient banking industry, and they make sure that when people came in to buy goods from them, that they invested in those factories and actually invested in raw materials that they brought in from India, from China, from all those other places. So creating that ecosystem basically becomes very important. And you're going to find a lot of countries realizing that this is their ability to capitalize. Albania just invested $10 million in Mira Murati's new AI company, and said that Albania wants to be basically the Estonia for AI or something like that. They want to be the new AI place to actually be in. You're going to find growing countries, new countries, El Salvador, or basically countries that realize that they want economic growth and GDP growth, actually cottoning onto this place where they're like, we'll take Chinese components and we'll make it a hub of finished assembly goods product, where our labor can have work to do. Dubai did this in the 80s, in the 90s and early 90s, where they basically became this like finishing house for materials and components coming from all over the world. And when you can do that and your origin rules actually support that, now you can become an export house that basically ships to the US or ships to other countries. And if you have a free trade agreement with the country, with USA now, or you have a preferential trade agreement with the USA, you basically can shoot up in your GDP, shoot up in your volume, shoot up in your exports and in your foreign country things. So I expect that a number of countries are going to actually start figuring that out in the next 6 months as a sustainable alternative to China. So now pay 10% more than China, maybe 15% more than China, and get the same Chinese components with the same finishing, and then basically figure it out. So short term, everyone's going to figure out how to go around China, but long term, everyone's going to figure out how to work with China on the component level, which ironically makes China stronger.
Because as well, since there is some type of transformation happening or assembly happening in those countries, then the actual rule of origin, the actual origin changes, right?
Yes.
With the actual parts, which I know we're going to get into more in depth on our ShipBob webinar, which I think also you all should definitely come to that. I will send a link I'll put the link in the chat and also in the follow-up email that I'll send out. But can we talk about rule of origin and as well as what it actually takes to actually transform a product and actually change the actual origin of a product where it actually then can be like what actually needs to happen in order to actually do that change?
Simple question. Let me ask you. So for example, if you take these glasses, right? I always talk about glasses because they're always in my hand. If you take the plastic inside these glasses as a sheet, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a material. You take this plastic that is essentially molded into these frames. That molding is a process. It's essentially a processing piece. Then you take a look at all these, these screws and all these things that attach the angles that put it together. That's a process. Now, if all you were doing is essentially pulling in these glasses into a country and just putting them in a box and putting a label on them, that's not sufficient transformation because the glasses remain the glasses. But if I basically brought the plastic separately, let's say these handles I bought separately, the plastic I bought separately, and the sheets I bought separately, and figure out how to actually fit in the plastic into these sheets and actually attach them, and then actually extrude out all these different sheets and then turn them into glasses, that's substantial transformation. So now I turned plastic, which is an HTS code of something which is just plastic sheets, into a finished glasses. That's substantial transformation because the HTS code changed, the product code changed. The product itself became a different product.
Yeah, I was just going to say on that, I think some people think if they just do some light kitting, that would constitute substantial transformation, and likely not. So for example, one time was trying to see if, because of Brazil's kind of similar policies where they required where they had high tariffs for incoming product, I tried to see if I could put in a speaker grill and just put it in the box with already everything assembled, and it wasn't enough. So, just doing light kitting even is not, I think some people think, if I just put a bunch of finished goods together. No, it's actually taking components, as Pranay said, and turning it into a finished good.
Do you think that, think about maybe larger companies, a bit larger companies, do you think that larger companies, it actually makes sense to maybe invest in some of this assembly production in different countries so they actually own that part of the manufacturing? Or is it better, like, how do you kind of weigh when it actually makes sense to actually maybe own part of like the assembly or part of that transformation that we're talking about that actually happens versus not, but still getting the benefits that you want, actually transforming in a country that has a much better trade agreement, for example, that's better for that's better for your business in the US. How do you think about that in terms of the vertical integration side?
Fun fact, a significant number of products are already produced with Chinese components in third-party countries today.
Okay.
It's not new. It's just that the vendors who are doing it are just buying the goods themselves. So the Chinese vendor is a vendor to the factory. So if you look at India, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, whatever the places, most of the times what's happening is if there's a high-tech component to it or any sort of industrial component to it, they're just buying these products from distributors who buy them from China domestically. So if I want to buy a button for a garment, that button probably came from China and was imported by the distributor, and he's selling them domestically to the factory. The factory thinks they're buying a domestic product. But the product probably wasn't even produced in America, in India. It was produced in China, or it wasn't produced in Mexico, it was produced in China. So they sold those buttons as a finished product to an importer who's now a distributor who put his own money to buy 1 million white buttons and is now selling them 1 gross at a time. A gross is 144. 144 pieces at a time to factories that are then attaching those buttons. Now, those buttons were basically made in China, but no one knows that because they were assembled as part of the garment in Mexico. So to Mexico, it looks like a finished good, but each of those components, whether it's the wax in the collar or the kind of stuffing in the collar or, the buttons or the labels or whatever it is, those are all normally Chinese products that are made in China. So you're already seeing Chinese components in every product you see and you make, even if the actual origin of that product shows made in Colombia, or it shows made in El Salvador, or shows made in Guatemala, or made in Honduras, or it shows made in India, made in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka imports all its polyester from China. But every single Victoria's Secret underwear is made in China, made in Sri Lanka, almost every one of them. And it shows made in Sri Lanka because they buy the yarn or they buy the product and they turn it into finished goods and they ship it and it's all Sri Lankan product. So companies already do this without realizing it. Big companies already do this without realizing it. The only difference is how quickly can you ramp up capacity in those other countries and what's the differential in cost to what you buy in China and what you buy in these countries. Because the difference is the small size companies who want to get it done as a service, who were reliant on Chinese vertical companies who did it domestically, are completely hosed. So if I'm not Victoria's Secret, the Sri Lankan factory will not touch me because I'm not doing 500,000 garments a month. But could I find a Sri Lankan factory that did 500 units and get the same quality as the 500,000 units? I'd have to go to China because China does those 500,000 units, but they do it for 15 or 100 or 200 or 500 customers because they aggregate those vendors. Now you get the added advantage of buying the same Chinese product that you would have bought in Sri Lanka for a better price or the same price, but without having to do the minimums of the commitment. Every country you talk to Latin America, you talk to India, you talk to Vietnam. What's your commitment? How many units are you going to buy? How long are you going to buy them for? How many years are you going to do it for? If you say that, anybody will set up the supply chain for you. But if you don't have a commitment and a volume, they're like, okay, I'm sorry, I can't support you. And you know who gets hosed? The SMBs we work with.
Yeah, I mean, that makes total sense. Well, I guess, will this change at all how you think about like minimum order quantities as well? And in terms of like what the actual minimums to actually even start a business would be? Because obviously it's going to be a lot more expensive if you actually do that transformation maybe in a different country up front, possibly, versus working maybe with like one factory, for example, and doing everything in China. How are you thinking about that in terms of like, do you think that the barrier to entry when it comes to entrepreneurship, I know that this is broad because I'm talking about different categories, but do you
No. I'll give you a very, very good example. You're
Yeah.
an expert in beverages, right? CPG. You've been covering CPG and beverage for years and years in the US, right? Brands like Poppy and people like that. You've covered.
I don't know if I'm an expert.
I'm just
I don't know
saying.
if I'm an expert, but yes,
You've been covering.
I do love beverage brands. Yes.
You love beverage brands. You've been covering the beverage brands. You tell me when a beverage brand starts up that goes to a co-packer that is hosing them on the back end, and a retailer or a distributor is hosing them on the front end, and they squeeze their ass off without having raising equity. Because, you know, everyone says airlines is the way a billionaire goes to a millionaire, but a beverage brand is how a millionaire goes to a thousandaire, right?
Yep.
And
the wine industry.
So think about that paradigm for every consumer product in the world. There's a price to basically buying from China. It's 145% tariff. If your brand can get off the ground because you know how to sell and you can absorb the 145% and make a very slim margin while you basically get the brand off the ground till you hit the escape velocity to actually create your own supply chain. Now you've got economies of scale that you can actually succeed as a consumer brand, but it's made it 100 times harder to be profitable while getting off the ground.
Yes, that makes sense. That makes total sense. Do you thinking about it from the other perspective? If there are the bigger companies that are setting up their supply chains differently, not just using, for example, China, they're actually doing transformation in using another country to do the transformation and set it up. Do some of these smaller businesses at all, do you think, might have any leverage whatsoever over their manufacturers that are just doing the same kind of supply chains as manufacturers, in that because these manufacturers theoretically might have lost some of their bigger customers, right? Can they say, hey, let's actually split the tariff costs? Because, you know, or have any leverage in that way where the manufacturer actually bakes in the actually pays for part of the tariff cost, or do you think not?
And only if the manufacturer owns a piece of that brand. Otherwise, no. If the manufacturer owns a piece of the brand and is actually an equity holder in the brand, then maybe. Otherwise, no chance. So now you're going to a manufacturer be like, invest in me. And they're like, why should I invest in you?
That's a fair point.
And just one point to go back to, you know, we kept talking in the previous sessions about is manufacturing really coming back to the US. I think Pranay answered that question, is if your components to make that factory are coming from China, you know, I think that answers that question. It just doesn't make a ton of sense for low-level manufacturing to somehow be resurrected in the US.
That makes sense. Can we also talk a little bit about
one more thing? Getting back to your UK thing, I just thought of this too. If I'm Lincoln or any of these other US car makers and I sell Navigators and these big expeditions, and now I have to compete with a Range Rover that's coming in at only 10%, and I can't export at that same rate to the UK. What is happening to the American high, premium brand at that point, right? It's just, it can't compete.
I want to see somebody fit a Navigator on London streets.
That's a good point.
Or their highways, which are, just like single lane pretty much.
I want to see someone fit that wheelbase on one of those cobble streets in Kensington. Oh my God.
That's a fair point.
Right behind the buses.
Even the buses are smaller, man. I guess if you give an entire generation of Americans Ozempic, you could probably give their cars Ozempic too.
Oh my God. All right. Can we also talk? I know we talked about the rule of origin change and how that works a little bit in terms of having to have that transformation. Pranay, you brought up something last session that I think we had a couple people confused. I know we had a couple of follow-up calls.
Yeah.
About people confused about it. Can you explain how that's, because that really isn't rule of origin change, right? Like you,
No.
in that case, that's more like duty paid, cross-border flow,
Yeah.
where you actually are paying the duties. Can you elaborate just in terms of what's the difference between what you were describing when it comes to rule of origin transformation versus, you pay the duties and cross-border flow, but the rule of origin doesn't actually change itself, but you're still able to actually benefit from tariff rates?
So there's an interesting technical differentiation. We just had a call with a trade lawyer in Washington. And the thing that I realized from that conversation is that there is a technical difference when you're moving goods from the importing country to USA, which is you got to do a customs declaration every time goods leave from one country to another country, declaring the origin of those goods. Mm-hmm. And if you declare the origin of those goods as the country you're shipping from, chances are you won't get caught, but you're not actually telling the truth on that origin. So let's just say that I am a trader in Singapore, or I'm a trader in UK, and we've been verifying this with legal counsel the whole time. Most times what happens is if you're an e-commerce brand that has a Shopify store in the UK and you basically have American customers and the goods are shipping from the UK 3PL to the American consumer, chances are DHL is basically going to charge you import duty based on the UK origin because that's where the inventory was picked up from and where it was delivered to the US. However, what should be legally happening, and I'm not sure if this is the loophole that people are doing, is that when they're exporting the goods, you should be saying consignee is the UK company, but the inventory origin is China.
So the tariff rate should be based off of China.
So technically, the tariff rate should be based off of the fact that the goods originated in China, even though the trader is shipping and selling the goods from the UK. It makes less sense to me because I personally believe that, and I might be wrong, I've doing this for 30 years, is that when you pay VAT and you pay import duties, you have essentially technically paid the value required to bring those goods in to your home country. And if you pay the duty to bring those values in from the home country, I'm wondering if customs duty is based on where the exporter sits or where this inventory was made. And if it is based on where I have to do this research because this is more fundamental research about global trade rather than it being this origin rules thing, because every country is different about origin rules. And so I've got to basically sit and figure out is if the exporter or the shipper of those goods is paid duties and those goods are officially domiciled and are not just in transit or held in suspense or something like that, but are officially in the territory of that country by paying customs duty commercially, are those goods now commercially of UK origin, even though they might be of Chinese manufacturing origin? So there's commercial origin and manufacturing origin, two separate things, right? Did I commercially bring those goods into the UK and do they have the right to exist in the UK commercially? Yes, they do, because I paid customs duty. But does manufacturing origin matter for tariffs to the US entry, or does commercial origin matter because those were actually cleared and delivered product? One lawyer we spoke to says that manufacturing origin matters. If you ask the administration, they'll tell you whichever the highest tariff is, that's what matters. I don't know what the litigation law says about this. I don't know what case law says about this. And I think there would be some interesting case law to be understood here, where if I officially paid customs duty to have the commercial right to own and operate those goods in a country, and then I decided to re-export those goods to another country because I had a customer in a different country, the fact that that country would treat those goods as the origin, as the manufacturing origin, and tax them accordingly, versus the commercial origin and tax them based on the commercial origination of those goods. That's where I think the law is a little hazy in my mind, and I need to get that clarified. But to me, that is what we're trying to figure out.
I'm just kind of curious is, with rule of origin, I think we've established that some type, in terms for that to change, some type of transformation has to happen, right? In order for rule of origin needs to change.
Well, that's manufacturing origin.
That's
origin, not commercial origin.
Okay.
So there's two separate things. It's like me telling you that, Mike, for you to be an American citizen, you need to be white. I'm just making it up, right? Because only Caucasians basically are genetically American. I'm just saying that out loud. But because your wife's mom is, South African, and your wife has an American passport, she commercially has the right to be an American, but she's not American because she's from South America, because that's where her parents are from. So manufacturing origin is South America, even though commercially you're an American because you paid your dues, you got your citizenship, you got your taxes, you did all that stuff, and now you're an American citizen. I'm talking about inventory. Inventory could be made in a country, and then it is destined for another country. That country receives it, pays the duty. Now, commercially, that inventory has the right to be that part of that in that country. Now, if that country decided, somebody from that country decided to move those goods to another country, commercial origin matters or in manufacturing origin matters at the time of import into that next country. That is essentially what we're trying to talk about here. No one's disputing that the manufacturing origin, to change manufacturing origin, the inventory has to be transformed, because that's a physical transformation. It's very clearly seen.
Right.
I have plastic and I have glasses. So plastic came from China. It went to India. India made the glasses. Now India ships glasses. It is Indian glasses. That's easy. But if I basically am sitting in, I don't know, India, and I said, I'm going to buy plastic from China. And I bought the plastic, and now it's plastic. I paid duty, I paid tariffs, I paid taxes, whatever it is. And the total value of the goods sitting in India is the cost of goods plus the duty plus the tariff. Commercially, now that value of those goods has gone up, because I paid the duty and tariff for it to be Indian commercial origin now. I sell those goods in India as if those are Indian goods because I have paid the fee for those goods to be sitting in India. If I were to sell those goods to a different country, does it matter that it came from China originally, even though I paid for those goods to sit in India? So the price I'm selling it at includes the fact that I paid for those goods to become Indian.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm thinking about your differences between commercial origination and manufacturing origination. Let's say tariffs, they're based off of commercial origination, right? And they're not based off of manufacturing origination. Then why would transformation even matter then?
It wouldn't. That's the point. That's the point I'm trying to make to you.
Okay. So transformation actually, like, I know we're talking about transformation a lot and everything like that in transferring, but if it's commercial origination, then it wouldn't. If it's tariffs are based off of commercial origination, then you actually don't even need it. You actually don't even need to transform the product, right? In order to
no, but then you cannot do that just to evade taxes. See, that's the point. Intent matters.
Okay.
What was your intent? Was your intent to bring those goods into the UK just to flip them to the US? Was your intent to bring them to the UK to sell them as part of your commercial entity, and that is your job and that is what you do anyways? And the fact that an American came and bought them as part of your wholesale pallets, does that matter at all? So with commercial origin goes commercial intent, but with manufacturing origin goes manufacturing intent. And that's how laws are written, right? 80% of almost 100% of the laws are not just written about the facts of the case, but also the intent. And so if you don't have intent to do it, then there are different laws that apply to you. That's the difference between manslaughter and first-degree murder, right?
Totally. I mean, as we started off with our first one, the intent of Section 321 was actually not what was actually not what was happening.
It was for a person walking through the duty-free channel and buying alcohol for his family.
100%. So I guess the thinking behind this administration in that elimination is, hey, this law actually is outdated because the actual intent doesn't actually match up to what people actually doing it. It's actually a loophole. Hamad, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this as well.
Which part?
Just commercial origination versus manufacturing origination.
I think another layer of complexity in this is new versus used goods.
Okay.
If I have a secondhand good that I'm reselling, what do we say?
Yeah.
If I have the box, if I don't have the box, what does that matter? So, I'll just say, like, I've always operated under the rules of manufacturing country of origin because that's kind of the world I lived in mostly before. So whatever the box said is what would be used. But, Pranay has a very valid point, and this is where kind of, the complexity comes in. And yeah, we should definitely figure that one out.
Are there any examples, Pranay, because we're talking about fraud here as well, in terms of, or rather, what's your intent, right? Like, are you trying to get a loophole from it? Sorry, Hamad.
I was going to say fraud is rampant in this stuff, man. I will tell you now, I have seen
fraud is everywhere,
right? Like, I have seen people declare a $5,000 jacket as $250.
Right.
I mean, it's insanity, right? Regardless of where it was.
But technically, if it costs $250 to make, then that's right.
No, I'm saying it doesn't even matter, right? What the cost was. This is like at a secondhand marketplace, but even
I see.
Fudging the country of origin, I've seen that happen. So, famously, I think there is a case where maple syrup was being brought into the U.S., I believe it was, and then they would ship it to Indonesia first, and then slap on an Indonesian, country of origin where it wasn't actually manufactured, only to show so that it could bypass Chinese tariffs. It happens all the time.
Well, I really appreciate those examples. That's really helpful.
And look, here's the thing that's going to happen. Any stakeholder that basically benefits from tariffs is going to start, first of all, they're already out there You can see them on LinkedIn. You can see them on X. You can see them on all these places. Already talking up what fraud looks like. Already talking up what e-commerce people are basically doing to hurt consumers. They're talking about how the sellers are doing to hurt consumers. And yeah, that's all true. Fraud is obviously there. Under invoicing is there. Fraud is there. I've started seeing people saying, oh, you can't declare the X works price as the actual duty price. You have to include mold fees. You have to include design fees in the X work price. That's just bullshit. That's not true. Right? Just because you basically want people to pay more tariffs and more duties doesn't mean that you basically make people jump through all these hoops against, established global trade norms and actual rules and laws that are existing. The CBP actually says if you break out the actual cost of goods versus the cost of services, you don't have to pay money on the cost of services. The CBP actually says that. Like if you basically separate out the cost of freight from the cost and the cost of insurance from the actual cost of goods X works, you only pay custom duty on the X works price. It's literally in the law. You don't break it out, you pay on the full CIF price because you didn't break it out. But if you break it out, that's all you pay on.
Wow.
So those are the kinds of things that are happening out there right now, which is like, oh my God, you're gonna be in fraud if you do this. You're gonna be afraid of fraud if you do that. You're gonna be susceptible to fraud if you do it this way. Like people have been doing business for years, officially following the rules and following the laws. And all of a sudden now, because Trump has tariffs and because somebody's 3PL business is going to get affected because people are holding goods overseas, they're like, whoa, you're going to commit fraud if you actually do that. And don't forget whistleblowers, because somebody now, what has happened is you've got all this content out in the market. And so people inside these companies who actually see their CEOs actually navigating global trade solutions and global trade problems and actually figuring out how to do things in a proper systematic way that actually meets international law, suddenly these people will be like, well, I could make a lot of money if I go to the CBP and tell them that my boss is actually breaking laws. Not to mention that now you've got all these enforcement actions against you. That's the kind of shit that's going to go down now. It may not be breaking the law, but I'll spend $1 million basically defending myself against the enforcement arm of the CBP because an employee basically saw some stupid TikTok video about what some people thought was fraud.
Well, originally why I mentioned fraud was more so because with commercial origination versus manufacturing origination, what are examples of, let's say it's commercial origination and that you believe you're basing the tariff rate based off commercial origination and not manufacturing origination as a company. And what are, the reason why, and your product has no transformation. The manufacturing origination is
Sure.
China or a country that has why? What are the right reasons intent-wise where it actually makes sense, and you're not kind of going through a loophole or the intent's actually in like a really good place, that you're actually not going through it, where it makes sense to actually classify the tariffs that you should pay as commercial origination? Because it seems like
I'll give you an example that the whole world is making money off. NVIDIA shipping goods to Singapore to escape Chinese tariffs against the US.
Right, but that doesn't seem. But that's
what is that? Is that? Is that commercial origin or is that actual manufacturing? Fucking H700s can't be manufactured in Singapore. 700s basically cannot directly ship to the China from the US. What are they doing in Singapore?
But like the intent there, right, is not fraudulent, but the intent there is trying to expose a loophole, right?
Evading tariffs is not fraudulent.
No, fraudulent.
Oh my God, Mike, what are you doing? I'm kidding.
No, I mean, there's obviously intent there to try to get around paying the Chinese tariffs. I'm saying that there are any examples where it actually
actually getting around Chinese tariffs. It's getting around U.S. embargo.
Okay.
U.S. doesn't allow you to ship H100s right to China. Yeah.
Okay, we'll get around something. I'm saying that are there any examples where companies are doing this and they're actually doing it for reasons that the intent actually is actually reasonable, is actually not.
So there's an interesting concept called final sale, which is essentially you are selling to a distributor and you don't care what the distributor does with the products. One of the most interesting concepts in global trade right now is this thing called diversion. I've talked about this before. Diversion is essentially Johnson & Johnson has a distributor in West Africa. Johnson & Johnson, basically, that distributor buys, 1,000 tins of baby powder from Johnson & Johnson and sells it in West Africa. However, there's another person in, say, Latin America who can't get Johnson & Johnson baby powder to save his life, but can sell that baby powder for 3 times the amount of money that the West African company buys it for. Because Johnson & Johnson baby powder won't export to that Latin American country, and so it's in huge demand over there. So the Latin American person goes to the West African person and says, you have an official distribution agreement with Johnson & Johnson. Instead of buying 1,000 tins, buy 5,000. You buy 5,000 tins at the cost of goods and you give me the additional 4,000 tins for 25-30% more. And then I will sell them for 3 times in Latin America. You've done nothing unofficial, but you've diverted 4,000 tins of Johnson & Johnson baby powder from West Africa to Latin America, where people have demand for it, because officially it can't get there. That's commercial origin diversion. And Johnson & Johnson would be like, that's not the intent of the product. I wanted it to end up in West Africa. You shouldn't be selling that to Latin America. The distributor's like, I just sold it to a person domestically. They sent it to Latin America. What the fuck do you want me to do? That's final sale. So if I'm a distributor that basically bought product from China, and then I had a customer, basically arm's length, no affiliation, bought from me because I'm sitting in Dubai and I bought Chinese goods. And a American guy walked in and said, I'm going to buy 1 million of your units because you've got them sitting here and I don't want to buy them from China. That's commercial intent. Because there was no fraud in that, because the Dubai guy bought his goods free and clear and wanted to just sell those goods to whoever he could find. And if there's a customer in the US he could sell to, he's like, okay, I'm selling you goods that I bought and I sold to you. He did not intentionally, the US was orchestrating the Dubai company to buy from China and sell to them to evade tax duty. That's commercial intent problem.
So yeah, I'm just thinking about it as well as, let's say, for example, like, let's say the trade route is China, Mexico, US, right? So let's say you're an e-com company and you warehouse in Mexico, and you say, well, the reason why I warehouse in Mexico is because then is right there, it's really close, and I can then ship product a lot more conveniently and easily. I think that the other side of it is like, well, why don't you just warehouse in the US instead of Mexico? Is the intent is that good intent? Is that bad intent?
Then the question is, are you shipping to any other country other than...
That actually is a fair point.
And then the intent is, did this company in Mexico be set up expressly for the intent of you just bringing in goods and holding it while you ship to the US? That's intent.
Yeah. We have this comment from Rosemary. Pranay is misleading you. Do not take his advice. Check with your customs attorney, broker or attorney.
She's absolutely correct.
Always check with your customer's broker or attorney for sure. That's certainly for sure. I don't think we have any more.
You should put disclaimers here. Nothing we actually advise is legal or binding advice to anybody.
Yes, I will put that out in the email just to make sure people know. Nothing. But at the same time, we're also happy to discuss one-on-one. We're doing 25-minute consults. We're more than happy to discuss one-on-one what you're currently going through, companies are currently going through. I think on that note, honestly, I think this was the best one yet. Thank you so much, Pranay and Hamaad, for your time. I will be sending out the recording just in case you weren't able to join live. But thank you all for your time. Have a great. Oh, and also, we're going to be doing we're partnering with ShipBob for a webinar further on this idea. We're kind of focusing our webinar on this idea of what country of origin really means, and what transformation as well really means. So would love for you all to check it out. We're going up on Tuesday. We're delighted to be partnered with ShipBob on this and part of their tariff series. Thank you all for, I'll also have this all in the email that I send to you all. But thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.